Her body was charred beyond recognition.
Nobody knew who she was. Nobody knew what happened to her.
I said, you're the prime target because you're beautiful and everybody wants you.
She was missing her nose, her ears, her fingers, her toes.
Not only is it disturbing, not only is it horrifying, but it's perplexing.
But there are demons out there, and they look like people.
A shocking murder becomes a dark mystery. The victim's body holds the key to convicting the killer. Every fiber is a clue. Every wound is a piece of the puzzle. In these cases, it's up to the medical examiner to find the crucial evidence and catch the murderer. This is Secrets of the Morgue.
Stonyton is a very rural type community. It's that New England feel. There are a lot of rolling hills, a lot of woods, a lot of quaint hamlets. A lot of long, winding roads. And it's very dark there at night.
One evening on a desolate stretch of country road, a blaze ignites in the dark.
A passerby who was driving along the road and thought that he had come upon a brush fire. He had stopped, pulled over, called 911, and as he was getting his fire extinguisher, a fire chief from the area had pulled up with his fire extinguisher.
The fire chief began to extinguish the flames. And he quickly recognized that this was a human. Once he saw a human, or what they thought was a human body, it became a crime scene quickly.
So instead of directly shooting the fire extinguisher towards the body, he had angled it upwards so that the chemicals will fall a little more gently and put the fire out, but at the same time preserving any evidence. Connecticut state troopers secured the scene, closed the roadway off, and they surveyed the scene looking for any items of potential evidence.
It's very important to document every aspect of how this body was found, what was on it, you know, what it looked like. Her body was charred beyond recognition. She had been wrapped pretty well in plastics and blankets, sheets, and duct tape, as if the killer had taped it to her. And once you saw the wrappings that were around the body, it was readily apparent that this was a dump site. This was not where this victim was killed.
Investigators hope the Connecticut State Medical Examiner will be able to identify the charred body. Dr. Ira Ganthier has been working as a forensic pathologist for 3 decades and has performed more than 4,000 autopsies.
Well, you have to be comfortable with the job, which a lot of doctors are not, dealing with the horrific things that we see. So, it's a job which I found enjoyable and satisfying, but you have to be built for it. In this case, we had a partially burned body, side of the road. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody knew what happened to her. The first thing we do is look at a body as it came in. In this case, it was wrapped in a plastic bag.
As they were unwrapping it, they realized there were several layers. They had to very carefully remove the wrappings to assure you didn't destroy any trace evidence.
We want to be as careful as we can to not contaminate the evidence so the police can take it back to the crime lab, look for fingerprints, DNA to give them leads of who may have done this. In examining the body, it was determined that it was a young female, young and like her 20s. I believe she was a light-skinned black female, but she could have been Latin. She was missing her nose, her ears, her fingers, her toes, and there was some skin removed from an ankle. First thing that comes to mind is that they're trying to obscure the identity of the deceased. With no fingers, you can't take fingerprints. With no toes, if she had toe rings or tattoos, those are gone now for purposes of identification. So it makes it harder for the authorities to identify the body.
When someone is mutilated such that their nose and fingertips and other identifying features are removed, it makes it more challenging, but not impossible, to identify someone.
The front was burnt quite a bit more severely than the back. That would mean that when she was set on fire, she was on her back.
And when they turned her over, the area of her lower back that was pressed into the ground was fairly well preserved. And when you looked at that area, there was an area in her lower back where the skin was missing. And it wasn't just missing. It was evident when you looked at the body and you looked at the photographs that it had been cut away.
My assumption is that there was a tattoo there.
Connecticut detectives scour the state databank, looking for any light-skinned young women reported missing with large tattoos on their backs. They find nothing. But when they expand their search to neighboring districts, they get a hit. 80 miles away on Long Island, New York.
The person that was missing was Rebecca Coster. The 24-year-old girl.
Rebecca is a nursing assistant who lives at home with her parents.
The missing persons report was filed by her father, Larry Ross. He had called the police because he was notified by her employer that day that she never showed up for work. She was out with her friends that night, and no one had seen her since 3:30 that morning.
In the missing persons flyer, they had pictures of what she looked like. They had a description of her height and weight and hair color. And they also had specific identifying features such as the tattoo she had. She had a large, I think it was a butterfly tattoo that was in the lower back area.
Despite the striking similarities between the women, Connecticut detectives are skeptical they have a match because of the distance involved. They turn to Dr. Ganthier to see if he can provide confirmation. He discovers that the killer made a strategic error.
The perpetrator left the teeth from the deceased intact.
Dental records are a very, very valuable source because that is a foolproof form of identification of human remains, providing that the teeth have not been removed. And even then, even if the teeth are removed, there are still markers within the jaw of an individual that a radiologist can make a comparison to that will assist you in that identification as well.
They reached out to Becky's family and asked for access to her dental records.
The Long Island police brought them up personally. So my office looked at the dental records, looked at the teeth from the deceased, and a match was made, which is just as good as fingerprints.
Rebecca Coster of Long Island is the woman found burning on the side of the road in Connecticut.
Now you have to show up at the family's house, and you have to give them the worst news they ever hear.
Rebecca Coster of Long Island has been identified as the Jane Doe found burning on the side of the road in Connecticut. Detectives steel themselves for the awful job of notifying her parents.
My husband gets the call. The detectives were at the house. They were waiting for me. And I looked at the detectives and I asked them. I said, it's bad news. And they said, please come have a seat. And they said they found Becky, that it was a homicide. And that they were going to go to great lengths to find out who did it to her. I just grabbed my coat and ran outside. I remember running halfway down my driveway, screaming, killed my baby. Someone killed my baby.
Detectives vow to find out how this young woman came to such a horrific end so far from home.
I'm married, I have 2 kids. So, yeah, something like this could happen to any family. We're dealing with the ultimate crime, and you want to make sure that whoever is responsible for this crime is going to be held accountable for their actions. So we started with talking to family and friends to try and develop a timeline of Rebecca Costa's last movements for that day before she went missing.
Becky was 24 years old and was a beautiful girl. In fact, she looked just like her mother, and they were very, very close.
I'm a nursing assistant, and Becky took the class, became a nursing assistant. She did home care with developmentally disabled adults. To see her happy in her job made me feel like, a success as a mom.
She was very bubbly, very vibrant young girl. And like most people who were 24, Becky was very personable. She liked to go out, she liked to have a good time.
Detectives learned that the night her daughter went missing, Barbara was scheduled to work an overnight shift.
I remember I was leaving for work, and Becky was hovering over her brother trying to get French fries from him. Becky told me that she was going out with her best friend, Nicole, and her boyfriend at the time, Dan. They were gonna go to their favorite spot, hang out for a little while, then she was gonna go home, go to sleep, and go to work in the morning.
Dan was Rebecca's boyfriend, but this was not a deep, long relationship. They had just begun dating, and it was certainly nothing serious.
I didn't get to really know Dan too much. He seemed to be genuine in his affection. He seemed like a nice guy. I knew they had their troubles, from what Becky had told me, but otherwise I didn't know too much.
As far as her mother knew, Rebecca went out with her friends that night and then returned home as promised.
Rebecca communicated with her mother via cell phone to let her know that she was home and that she was safe. And this was about 3:30 in the morning.
I was in the middle of morning rounds. My husband had called me, stating that Becky didn't show up for work. I give her a call, no answer. I leave her a message. Call her again, no answer.
This was unlike Becky. For her not to communicate or respond back to her mother was very, very unusual.
I go home, and the only thing I can think of, well, let me contact Nicole.
But Nicole has no idea where Rebecca is. She says she went home early and left Rebecca with Dan and some other friends.
Anybody who was last with the victim before he or she disappears is going to be, a prime suspect. And when you add a boyfriend to the mix, it's just always, somebody that you're going to look at very hard.
Detectives locate Dan and haul him down to the station. According to his version, he and the others dropped her off at 3:30 a.m.
Dan said he walked her into the front door, made sure she got in safely, and they left her there, and that was the last time he saw or heard from her.
Dan swore up and down, I loved Becky. I would never hurt Becky.
Detectives suggest that Dan could clear his name by taking a polygraph test.
Investigators will often broach the topic and ask a person if they're willing to take a polygraph as a way to determine if they could be hiding something, if they feel suspicious or guilty about something. So it's often used as a probe, as a way to try and see how guilty is a person.
Dan submitted to a polygraph. The focus of the polygraph is if he had any knowledge of her whereabouts, had any knowledge of the events leading up to her disappearance. The results of the polygraph were that he was being untruthful.
Despite the puzzling results, investigators aren't convinced that Dan was involved in Rebecca's murder.
Polygraph can be used as an investigative tool, but they're not 100% reliable. And Dan cooperated fully with the investigation.
They interviewed him thoroughly, and the police searched his home from top to bottom. And certainly there were no red flags to them that she'd ever been there.
We try and corroborate everyone's story with other people that were at the scene, and Dan's story and their friend's story all matched up. They were all identical.
With no hard evidence linking Dan to Rebecca's murder, they need to widen the suspect pool. Detectives turn to Dr. Ganthier to determine the time of death.
The deceased was observed to be in a bar and having drinks. In normal people, they metabolize about 1 drink per hour. At Autopsy, we took specimens for toxicological examination for drugs and alcohol, and the alcohol came back negative, as well as the drug screen. Once you die, the metabolism stops, so that tells you that she was alive after she left the bar for a period of time.
Dr. Ganthier lists the time of death as 4 hours after Rebecca was last seen, but it's only his best guess.
It's really an inexact science, no matter what's written.
Given the estimated time of death, investigators need to know if Rebecca spoke to anyone after Dan dropped her off at 3:30 a.m.
Her family was able to pull up Rebecca Costa's phone records on the computer to see, of course, who would be the last person to contact her. They had saw that there were 2 phone calls into her phone early that morning from the same number, a 617 number. They were at 4:10 and at 4:27 in the morning.
It's quite clear that this person was probably the last person to speak with Becky.
Detectives suspect that whoever Rebecca spoke with on the phone at 4:27 in the morning is likely the person who killed her.
Becky Costa, like so many young girls, made a very foolish decision that night to trust that no harm could come to her.
Becky never believed that anybody would ever hurt her. And I said, Becky, you're the prime target because you're beautiful and everybody wants you. But there are demons out there, and they look like people.
Police are trying to locate the source of the 2 calls made to Rebecca Costa the morning she was murdered.
The police were able to obtain very quickly the cell phone records for that phone number that had been contacting Becky.
When you talk on a cellular device, your conversations are bouncing off of cell towers all over North America. And as you move, your conversation bounces from tower to tower to tower. And in this day and age, we can get those records from the service providers. And through a not very complicated formula, they can triangulate to some degree of certainty what area you are in.
Police looked at the cell tower information. They could clearly ascertain that the person using that phone was moving now in communicating with her. And he was moving in a direction west to east to go to Rebecca's house.
The first call at 410 was for approximately 15 minutes, and the call at 427 was for approximately 20 seconds. So based on the location of the cell sites and the duration of the last call, it is my belief that this person was at Rebecca Costa's house, letting her know that he was there.
But they still don't know who the caller is or how Rebecca's body ended up in Connecticut 15 hours later.
We tried contacting that phone number, and there was no response. And there was no phone record with the 617 number in our system or any place that we could find. It was never listed.
With heavy hearts, they deduced that the number must be attached to an untraceable burner phone.
So we had no idea who the 617 number was.
While investigators try to identify the person on the other end of the phone number, Dr. Ganthier struggles to determine Rebecca's cause of death.
If the body is burnt, one of the questions that comes up is, was the person alive at the time of the fire? One of the ways to detect that is looking for soot in the deceased lungs. And if there is, that tells you she was breathing at the time of the fire, so we know she's alive. There was no soot in the lungs, and from that you can imply that she was dead at the time of the fire.
The doctor searches the body for other wounds that may have led to her death.
The external injury on the skin was very difficult to find due to the burning. It obscured it. So we looked at all the vital organs, heart, liver, lungs, kidneys, and we saw a stab wound of the liver, and associated with the stab wound was several hundred cc's of fluid and clotted blood in the abdominal cavity. So that tells me she's got an injury of the liver.
But he isn't certain the stab wound to the liver is what killed her.
She had 4 sharp force injuries of the neck. I just wasn't sure if they were pre or post-mortem due to, in part, the burning. There's veins in the neck as well as arteries, and if the person is alive and you cut one of these veins of the neck, it's possible that air gets sucked into the vein, and if you get what they call an air embolus, it goes to the heart, and it just stops the heart being able to pump, and the whole system backs up, and you're dead as a doornail in a very short period of time.
Dr. Ganthier takes x-rays to confirm his suspicions.
You could see the blood air level on x-ray in the heart. So that tells me that the wounds of the neck, at least one of them, occurred while she was alive, and air got sucked into the venous system, went to the heart, stopped the heart dead.
Because of the multiple sources of wounds, Dr. Ganthier lists the official cause of death as a result of all of them.
We know it was a homicide, that somebody did this to her, and multiple stab wounds of the neck and the liver is what killed this woman.
Armed with the cause of death, police returned to tracing Rebecca's movements.
They knew from their interviews with the people that Rebecca was with that they had gone to this particular bar, Butcher Boy, And they were able to quickly ascertain that they had a surveillance system, and they were able to view and obtain all of the surveillance footage from the night Becky was there. When they looked at the footage, they were able to determine that Becky was in fact in the bar. She's sort of sitting by herself, her boyfriend and her friends are off talking to other people. And they could see this person approaching Becky. He was a little bit older, you know, he wasn't a 23-year-old. He was dressed conservatively, like a sweater type of vest. So he looked unassuming. He enters her space and enters it quickly, and there is communication between them for a period of time.
Watching the video, you can see them both on their phones together. It appeared that they were exchanging some sort of information.
It looked like this person took her phone and was punching in a number.
Based on what they've just seen, investigators re-interview the people who were with Rebecca that night. And one of them, a woman named Jennifer, remembers something new.
She had told us about this male subject at the bar that she didn't know that was sitting next to them. She said that this subject made her very uncomfortable, that he was very pushy and did seem creepy with the questions that he was asking her. And he actually took her phone and put his name in her phone with his number, hoping that she would call him. So we took her phone, and computer crimes detectives were able to extract the information. We were able to see that a J. Brown was put into her contact list with the 617 number.
Finally, they have a prime suspect for Rebecca's murder.
The 617 number that we saw on Rebecca Acosta's phone records is the same 617 number that this person, Jay, put into Jennifer's phone.
But before investigators have a chance to track down Jay Brown, they receive an urgent message from the Connecticut Crime Laboratory.
The latent fingerprint examiner was able to process that duct tape that had been wrapped around Rebecca's body. And they developed two thumbprints, a left and a right thumbprint, on the sticky side of that duct tape. I've been doing this a very, very long time, and you don't often get fingerprints on the sticky side, particularly where there's been a fire.
Detectives send the fingerprints to the state data bank.
They did a physical comparison of prints that were on file with the state and concluded that there was an identification of both the left and the right thumbprint to an Evans Ganthier.
In a matter of hours, investigators have unearthed two prime suspects for this horrific murder. Yet the question of who killed Rebecca Coster remains unanswered. Investigators have two prime suspects on their hands for the slaying of Rebecca Coster. Jay Brown has no criminal record, but it's a different story for Evans Ganthier.
He had a criminal background. It wasn't particularly serious, but they were able to determine that among other things which were of great interest to the police, he had domestic incidents with his girlfriend, and there were allegations that he was pimping her out. And that he liked to photograph women in his garage. So there were a couple of things in his background which were disturbing.
Investigators asked their witness, Jennifer, to come back down to the station for a second time.
We know that Evans Ganthier's fingerprints are on the tape that bound Rebecca Coster at this time. So we then take Evans Ganthier's photo and we put his photo in a photo array and we show that to Jennifer. And Jennifer positively identifies him as the person who took her phone, identified himself as Jay, and put his number in her phone.
It's a revelation. Jay Brown isn't a person. He's Evans Ganthier's alias. Investigators pour all their resources into finding Ganthier.
We knew that he had a vehicle that he has had tickets with and had been arrested driving this vehicle, which was an SUV. And we knew that his girlfriend had a residence in the Bronx. So we were checking and surveilling the residence. One night, there was a team of guys that located his SUV parked next to the residence where his girlfriend lived. And the following day, we observed him walk into the vehicle, and he was placed under arrest. We bring him to our headquarters, and I interview him along with another detective. He consents to the search of his vehicle, and he consents to the search of his residence.
Ganthier claims there's nothing for police to find, as he had no hand in Rebecca's death.
So that residence was searched. In the garage, there was a roller, a scrub brush, a broom, a cement cleaner, and some paint and a paint tray. And you could tell that there was an area that had been cleaned over and painted over. That definitely looked suspicious. But there was nothing that would link Rebecca Costa to that scene. But then his vehicle is processed at the crime lab. And they discover questionable red stains throughout the car.
There's a console, and on that console, on the driver's side, on the passenger side, on the driver's side, there was a blood stain. And the blood was dripping downward. If you ever sit in your vehicle, you have your seat buckle next to you, and you have that little bit of space in between your seat and the console. If you move the seat back and you go all the way down to the floor, that's where the blood was pooling.
Investigators take samples of the blood found in the vehicle and send it for DNA testing.
This blood is determined to be the blood of Rebecca Costa. So we could tell that Rebecca Costa was in this vehicle, and it appeared that something violent had happened to her while she was in this vehicle.
Investigators confront Ganthier with this damning evidence. But instead of confessing, he launches into an elaborate story of defense.
He says, "I'll tell you, but you're not going to believe what happened."
He claimed he'd met her in the bar, they just talked, and he decided that he would call her because he wanted to continue his own party.
She had given him directions to her house. Once in the car, he said that she explained that she couldn't hang out long, that she had to go to work in the morning. And then once on the way to his house, she started foaming at the mouth, like she was having some medical emergency.
And when they arrived, he opened up the garage, and Becky was unsteady on her feet, so much so that she needed his assistance, and he had to put his arm around her just to walk her into the garage and keep her steady.
He claimed that he brought her to the house to try and give her a glass of water, and when they were walking in his garage, she had tripped over a set of dumbbells, hitting her head on the cement, and started bleeding profusely from her head. He went on to explain that he put her in the back of his SUV, and he was going to drive her to Mather Hospital. And on the way to Mather Hospital, he said he turned around and she had stopped breathing.
When he brought her back to his house, she died. And, well, he panicked.
So he tried to hide her identity and make her look like a missing person.
He said that he cut off her fingers, he cut off her toes, He admitted to carving the tattoo out of her lower back. Then he told the police that he, in fact, took her body wrapped up in the back of his SUV. He drove on to the Port Jefferson ferry. Once he got to Connecticut, he was just driving, and he ended up not far from Stonington. He didn't know what to do with her. He didn't hurt her, he didn't kill her, but, you know, what was he gonna do? Because people might not believe him. So he admitted to the police that he bought some gasoline. He drove around, and then he just panicked some more because now he's been driving around with her for so long. He just wanted to get her out of the car. So he just pulled over in the area that her body was ultimately found, threw her onto the side of the road, poured a little bit of gasoline on her, and lit her on fire. Then you look at the sheer brutality and the gruesome acts that he engaged in. Once you go to those lengths, you're not hiding or concealing the crime of accident. You're trying to conceal the crime of murder.
Evans Ganthier admits to mutilating and burning Rebecca's body, but adamantly denies killing her. He says she died as a result of an accident.
When someone's caught committing a brutal murder, and they know in their own minds that it's over, the only thing left for them is to save some face. And the way they do that is to try and minimize their involvement, to extricate themselves from the nasty part of this homicide.
Evans Ganthier was very, very convincing, because like most sociopaths, he has no soul, he has no conscience, and the only thing he's concerned about is protecting himself.
He stated that he just wanted to remove her identity, but clearly he was trying to remove any evidence that showed that she was violently killed.
Seasoned homicide detectives have a good sense. You know, they can often say, this guy's just lying to me, I know it. But, you know, knowing it and being able to get your suspect to admit he's lying are two different things. And the most successful way is to confront him with the truth you have.
Investigators need Dr. Canford to refute Ganthier's story. Otherwise, he could get off with a much lesser charge.
The charge would be, instead of murder, it would be assaulting a dead body. So you have to prove that she's alive at the time the incident occurred. She was definitely alive with a stab wound to the liver because there was a hemorrhage in the liver as well as fluid and clouded blood in the abdominal cavity. And she was alive for at least one of the stab wounds of the neck because we had the air embolus, which came from the air getting sucked in from one of the stab wounds of the neck. He tells us that she tripped, I believe, over a weight, struck her head, and that's what killed her. But when I examined the head, there was no evidence of skull fracture, there was no evidence of subdural hemorrhage, there was no evidence of trauma. But what the autopsy did show is she had stab wounds to the neck, a stab wound to the liver, and that's what killed her, not this cockamamie story of she fell and hit her head.
Armed with the medical examiner's irrefutable conclusions, detectives charge Ganthier with second-degree murder. But even throughout the trial, he maintains his innocence.
He was the victim through this whole thing. He didn't do anything. He apologized for being a panicky person who didn't do the right thing. One of the biggest points to the jury in not only just proving the obvious and disproving the ridiculous was that we also had what I thought was very compelling physical evidence. If you looked at his story, she was never bleeding in the front seat of that car. So that story was a lie. He claimed that he had put her into the back of his SUV, not the front, passenger seat, but the back. According to him, there was no injury, and he never put her body in the front, even after he dismembered her. So, how else did that blood get there but for the fact that an act of violence occurred in that car?
The trial lasts an excruciating 4 weeks.
Rebecca's mom sat through every single day, and her heartbreak was palpable. You could feel it. But she just wanted to make sure that she was there for Becky, and she got justice for Becky.
We weren't planning on going to the arraignment, and then I changed my mind. It was arraignment day that I found out the things that he did to my daughter. And my head's been in turmoil ever since. But that was the worst day of my life.
After deliberating for just 5.5 hours, the jury finds Evans Ganthier guilty.
The jury believed that the cause of death and the manner of death were homicide by stab wound beyond a reasonable doubt.
After the long process of the trial, you're able to sit there in the courtroom with the family and listen to the juror's verdict. You could feel the sense of relief that the family has, a sense of closure that someone is being held responsible for what they did to their daughter.
To have the jury say guilty was very gratifying for us as prosecutors, because we know that we brought this horrific killer to justice, and he is not walking the streets again.
The judge sentences Ganthier to the maximum 25 years to life and condemns his unthinkably cruel behavior after Rebecca's death.
In this case with Rebecca, if we didn't find what happened to her or with the aid of the police figure out who she was, she would have just been buried in Potter's Field and nobody would have known anything. So we did speak for the dead, the medical examiner, the police department. Yes, we did.
Finding him guilty, yes, I'm happy. But it was more of a relief that he wouldn't be out there hurting anyone else. But it doesn't bring her back. I wish I could be the type of person to forgive, but I can't. Not in that case, anyway.